What up, Sundogs? I had a few requests to explain what was the mastering process behind Union. But first of all, you may ask yourself, what even is mastering? Production is a step in the music process that ensures you have the appropriate sound to accurately translate your musical intention. If the music is powerful, you need a powerful sound to express it. If it's intimate, you need an intimate sound, etc. This can be achieved using a wide array of audio effects such as compression or equalization. There are two main steps you can consider after the instruments have been recorded: mixing and mastering. The difference is very simple. If you apply these audio effects on several different instrument tracks, like compression on the bass or equalization on the guitars for instance, it's called mixing. If on the other hand you apply these effects on one single track that contains all the instruments already mixed together, it's called mastering, and it's usually the very last step before the song gets sent to digital platforms or physical pressing. In the analog days of recording music, mastering used to be a fairly specific process that required specialized mastering engineers with dedicated gear. In today's digital era, it is very easy to use the same softwares to master a song you mixed, even within the mixing project. You usually have a master fader that plays all the instruments together, and if you apply audio effects on that fader, it's basically mastering. Then why do people often still hire a different engineer for the mastering? Well, the answer is simple. You're sending your track to an audio expert who will listen to it with A. a different set of speakers and headphones, and B. a fresh and objective perspective from someone who's never heard the track, especially not on loop for hours, if not weeks or months. And those are two reasons why an external mastering engineer will be able to make you notice some details or even huge problems that you might have missed, because our brains get used to anything and you've heard the song so many times you can't hear anything wrong with it anymore, even though there might be big mistakes that will immediately shock another engineer. As a mastering engineer myself, I do think it's part of my job to tell my thoughts about the mix and what could be adjusted to make it even better. So yes, I did criticize Union, even though, to be fair, it is certainly one of the most brilliant productions I've ever been sent. Now, this objective perspective is already useful to help a mixing engineer who's been working several hours or days on the same track, which is already something that you have to be able to bear mentally. So now just imagine being in a situation like Phil's, where over the course of 2 or 3 years you wrote a major part of the music, a bunch of the synths, played and recorded all the different guitars with tones you made yourself, programmed all the bass and all the drums, and then did the entire mixing for all the songs. It definitely was a wise idea to lend the last steps to someone with no psychoacoustic fatigue whatsoever. So now on part 2, what did I actually do? So I will start off by saying I think mastering is commonly associated with a very technical process that guarantees correct formats for distribution and correct reproduction of the frequency spectrum across various listening systems. And that is true to an extent, but I believe it also has a really musical value. It can still make or break the musical intention. It's still art. So that being said, I start off by listening to the song and really try to understand the music and the story it wants to tell. With that in mind, I can start with some simple moves that will make the song structure even more striking and effective, like writing automation, so that for instance the volume goes up during a very intense section. It's a very common trick in electronic music and pop to get the listener used to a certain volume during the intro, and once the drop or chorus hits, it's just like 1 dB louder so that it suddenly feels even bigger and more powerful. Now, before we dig into the effects, let's just say that the point of mastering also is, like aforementioned, to make the song sound good wherever it's played, and that includes when compared to other songs in the same genre. In our case, it looked like the potential fanbase of the band will stream the music in between songs from Haken, Tesseract, Leprous or Periphery. So I literally just import songs from those artists inside my software, or within a very useful little plugin called Magic AB, so I can quickly compare how Union lives up to those references. Very quick note for those who don't know, music is produced with a type of software called a digital audio workstation, which usually comes with effect plugins, but you can also load plugins from other companies that you buy to expand your collection and mixing possibilities. That is what I mean when I say DAW and plugins. So when I master my own songs, I usually don't need that many plugins since the mix is already close to what I want the final song to sound like. But when I receive the mix from someone else, obviously there most likely will be things that I want to adjust. In the case of Union, the changes I wanted to make were actually rather subtle. However, I still somehow ended up with a lot of plugins, and the reason for that is that most of them are making pretty minor changes to the sound and it just adds up, rather than having like 2 plugins with the knob turned at max. Not that it would be a bad thing either, there are no rules for that, you just have to do what works best for the specific music you're mastering. And by the way, not only the methods can change from song to song, but also your own methods and workflow are supposed to change as you improve as an engineer, which is what I'm striving to do. I practice it on a daily basis and constantly question what I'm doing and how could it be done better. So I have to admit, I'm looking at the Union mastering chain right now and all I can think of is I wouldn't do this if I had to master it today. There are so many things that I changed my mind about or new methods that I've experimented with since the album released, but this video is supposed to be about what I did back then, so I'll show you that and maybe some extra insight on things that I would do differently now. All songs use the same plugins, but each of them had their own parameters adjusted depending on the song. I started by making all tracks go through 2 analog simulations, the Slate Virtual Tape Machine and the Slate Virtual Mix Bus, which create a type of saturation that's typical of older recording consoles, supposedly making you sound more like a real band with organic instruments and big old gear, and less like some fucking millennial making loops on their laptop in their bedroom. It's such a boomer thing to say, I kind of hate it. I think any way of making music is valid and is real music, so the real reason I actually enjoy these effects is that the saturation can give you a really full and lively low end and mid area without being too harsh like a digital type of saturation would. In a very similar fashion, I also used the exciter from Isotope's Ozone 8. This one's not marketed as really vintage or analog, so saturating the high end gives extra brightness and high definition shine that I thought would be very appropriate for this pretty modern music with a lot of synths and sound design. I used the Waves R-Bass to add a little more subs. It doesn't just boost them like an EQ would, it kind of extends them lower by creating low sub-harmonics, so that, for instance, the kick thrusts even deeper in your chest. However, that can overload the low end a bit since the bass guitar and kick drum share that space, so I also had a multi-band compressor to ensure this extra low end remained controlled. Then I used the mid-side EQ using FabFilter Pro Q2, because the 3 wasn't released yet, or at least I didn't have it. Now you may think this looks extremely dramatic, but this low end that I cut is only on the sides of the stereo field, so the bass guitar or kick drum, which are in the center, are left unchanged. And now they don't have to fight for that space since the guitars don't have any boomy lows anymore. Next up I got a de-esser. Like its name suggests, it can literally remove the consonant S, or more exactly, it compresses any frequency that is close to sounds like S or sh, which can be really aggressive to our ears if they're too loud. Now that's an effect you would normally use during mixing, exclusively on vocal tracks. However, here it wasn't worth telling Phil to go back and modify the mix of the whole album again just because I thought they were slightly loud. And it worked out pretty well on mastering. Note that oftentimes you can't use this during mastering because it tends to interfere with cymbals. For instance, the hi-hat cymbal produces frequencies that are very close to s, so I was just lucky there. Next up I got a compressor. Compression has a lot of purposes, but the 2 main ones I wanted here were that, first of all, it gives a lot of punch. It's really pleasing to hear how much energy it can give to a song. And secondly, it glues the instruments together, so that instead of feeling like several separate instruments on their own, it feels like one band and one song. Then I got a plugin called Soothe, which can automatically tame down the frequencies that poke out too much of the song. I set it up in a way that it focuses on some vocal frequencies, which greatly help with gluing the vocals even more with the music, so that Andy sounds like he's part of the bandy and not that he's just doing some awkward karaoke on top of a produced instrumental, which tends to be a problem that engineers can face, especially in the beginning. Up next is another EQ that I use to tame a little bit the high mids, which can be harsh and fatigue your ears really quickly, and boost even a bit more of those shiny highs. As a limiter, I used the Slate FGX on that project. It's not exactly a limiter, but it does the same job of getting your song pretty loud and thick without destroying the punch of the drum peaks. It's really good at that. The next two and last plugins are clippers. Like their name suggests, they literally just clip out any peak that's poking out of the audio, so you have a nicely packaged waveform that can be played back loudly without causing nasty uncontrolled distortion. Hard clipping causes a form of distortion per se. Abrupt angles on a waveform do create additional high frequencies, and you could fully avoid it by using soft clipping or compression or limiting, but they tend to soften the transient a lot in the process, which can make for a mushy brickrolled sound soup of noise. I don't want that, I want the drums to punch me really hard and tell me where to headbang. So a good compromise is to use limiting alongside clipping. That way I can get a really punchy and angry sound with a clipper without having to push it to a point where distortion starts being audible, which can happen pretty quickly as you turn the knob and immediately makes the entire production amateur and terrible, so you really gotta be cautious when you use that kind of tool. The difference between the two I'm using is that the GST-1 has a mix knob, so here I have a first stage of gentle clipping where more than 40% of my signal actually remains completely untouched, and then the Event Horizon by Stillwell, which I now can crush to finally achieve this giant wall of guitars and synths where the drums still cut through with great punch. There's no rule concerning which goes first between limiting and clipping, and I generally advise testing both orders on a per album basis or even per song basis. However, I didn't have the FabFilter Pro L2 back then, and since I've got it, I've been putting it last in the signal chain for one reason: true peak limiting. Now, I won't get into how it works because it's a bit complicated for today's video, but the result is that your song will never go in the red and distort even after someone's downloaded it from a really shitty YouTube to MP3 converter or such. A common way to achieve this was to simply turn down your output ceiling by 2 or 3 dB before exporting the final file. However, that puts your song at risk of sounding a bit weak when streamed on platforms that don't have a normalization algorithm. Now with TruePeak I can just leave it at max and fear nothing. That's pretty much it. So maybe it was hard to tell the difference every time I added a new plugin, but just like I said in the beginning of this video, each of them had a really subtle effect, but they all add up to a really big difference. So just so you get a better idea, here's an example of before and after mastering. That's a lot more beef, isn't it? That's pretty much it. This video was pretty targeted towards those of you who have little to no experience with audio, but were curious about one of the many reasons why this album sounds so good, mastering being apparently one of the most mysterious ones. So if there's anything you didn't quite understand, feel free to ask in the comments below. And if you're more experimented with audio and are curious about more advanced stuff that I didn't really cover here, feel free to even just shoot me a PM on Facebook. Actually, I would love to discuss it. I plan on doing more tutorial and video explanations in the future, so feel free to comment a request, and you can subscribe and also hit the bell button if you want to be notified every time I upload something, which might be something that you requested. Thanks to Andy and the Bendy for the sick album. I'll link their stuff in the description in case you don't have merch yet or like you don't have one of these yet. Thanks for watching this video. See you soon.